I'm Margot Landry, 72 years old, and 3 years ago I buried my husband and watched the family I raised drift away without a backward glance. For a long time, I told myself distance was just life moving on. But the truth settled in quietly. They had stopped seeing me. Then one morning, an envelope arrived, thick and heavy, my name written in silver script, without the word Mom in sight. Inside was an invitation to an evening in my honor, the first contact from my children in years. By the end of that night, I would learn exactly what kind of honor they had in mind, and why I would never forget the way it ended. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand your ground when someone tried to write you out of your own story. I grew up in a small Ohio town where neighbors shared pie recipes and everyone knew when your porch light burned out. My parents believed in working with your hands, paying your debts, and helping anyone who needed it without expecting repayment. Those values followed me into my marriage with Samuel Landry, a man who could fix a roof before breakfast and still be home in time to read bedtime stories to our children. We didn't start with much, just a modest house and a shared savings account, but we built a life brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. When Samuel's career in city planning took off, we moved into a larger home and eventually established a family foundation to support local education programs. Even then, I kept our lives simple, careful never to lose sight of where we came from. My children, however, grew up in a different world. Laura loved art galleries and fine linens. Ryan preferred sports cars and long lunches at country clubs. Claire married into our family later with her polished manners and effortless charm that seemed to impress everyone but me. I watched their tastes change as quickly as their priorities, but I believed that deep down, they remembered the roots Samuel and I planted. After his passing, that belief began to erode. Laura moved my belongings into a guest room without a word. Ryan stopped calling unless he needed access to a family account. Claire hosted dinners where my name never appeared on the guest list. So when that ornate invitation arrived, embossed and floral, I held it longer than I meant to, tracing the edges as if they might tell me why now. The event was to be held at Ryan's new home, the one with the open-concept kitchen and sprawling backyard meant for catered events. Laura's name was printed at the bottom, no handwritten note, no hint of warmth. I could have tossed it aside, let the evening pass without my presence, but something about it felt staged, too perfectly assembled, too deliberate in its timing. The following day, I phoned Dolores, an old friend who still worked part-time at a florist where Laura once placed large corporate orders. The pause before she spoke told me more than her words. She said the venue had been booked months ago, but my name was only added last week. It wasn't about honoring me, it never had been. I hung up slowly, the weight of her words settling into the quiet of my kitchen. Still, I decided to go, not to bask in affection, but to see with my own eyes what they were truly planning. As the date crept closer, I caught myself studying that invitation again, wondering if the years apart had been a prelude to something I couldn't yet name. I didn't know then that the night ahead would strip away every illusion I had left about my place in their lives, and that I would walk out carrying more than just the sting of disappointment. The week passed slowly each day, bringing me closer to the evening printed in gold script. When Saturday arrived, I left the house a little early, not wanting to stumble in late or give them a reason to whisper. The sky was still pale when I turned onto Ryan's street, the kind of late winter light that made the bare trees seem sharper against the air. His driveway was already lined with cars, and a young man in a vest motioned for me to pull over to the curb. His polite smile didn't reach his eyes, and I noticed he didn't ask for my name. From the curb, the house looked like something out of a glossy magazine. Golden lights strung through the hedges threw a soft glow over the entryway, and the sound of voices carried through the open windows. When I stepped inside, the scent of polished wood and fresh flowers filled the air, almost masking the faint aroma of catered food from the kitchen. Someone brushed past me without meeting my eyes. A server, no older than 16, guided me toward a small table set against the sliding door near the kitchen. It wobbled when I sat one leg shorter than the others, and there was no name card or glass of water waiting. From my corner, I could see the main part of the backyard. Round tables dressed in cream linens held crystal glassware and low bowls of roses. Guests mingled easily, laughing in clusters. Laura stood near the front with a neat stack of note cards in her hand, her hair swept back, and her makeup precise. Ryan stood a few feet behind her, straightening his tie, while he spoke to someone I didn't recognize. Claire glided between groups in a gold dress that shimmered with each movement, smiling at others, but never at me. When her gaze finally met mine, she offered only the smallest nod before turning away. A faint tapping on glass pulled the attention of the crowd. Laura lifted her champagne flute and began to speak, her voice carrying evenly over the murmur of the guests. She talked about the next chapter for the family, about vision and stewardship. Not once did her eyes land on me. Ryan stepped forward, next, his tone smooth but measured, as he spoke about structure and the future of what we've built. From my seat, the words felt like they were meant for someone else entirely. That's when I noticed the small table set near the front, holding a leather-bound folder stamped with gold letters. Beside it stood a notary with a clipboard in hand, watching the speakers with the same patient stillness I'd seen in bank offices. Ryan's voice dipped lower, but the meaning was clear. They were ready to formalize the transition. Claire's lips curved slightly, as though she'd been waiting for this point all evening. When the notary's gaze shifted toward me, Laura stepped down from the small platform and crossed the yard. Her heels clicked against the patio stone, steady and deliberate. She stopped just in front of me, leaned closer, and said, "This is just a formality, Mother. We need your signature so we can move forward." The words were calm, but her eyes didn't invite agreement. Before I could answer, her hand came up and struck my cheek, not hard enough to hurt, but precise enough to make the moment ring clear. Claire let out a faint breath through her nose. Ryan clapped once, the sound sharp in the open air. No one else spoke. The music from inside the house seemed far away, as though it belonged to another gathering entirely. The notary stepped forward, holding out his pen. "Mrs. Landry," he said, his voice careful, "if you could initial here and here." He kept his eyes low, as if avoiding any exchange that might slow the process. I glanced at the folder. The words, "Family Estate Reallocation," glinted under the lights. Inside pages were neatly typed sections, highlighted signatures already in place. Only one line remained empty, mine. I closed the folder gently and rested my hand on top. "I won't be signing anything tonight." The silence that followed felt heavier than the winter air. Laura's jaw tightened. Ryan shifted his weight. Claire folded her arms and let the corner of her mouth lift just enough to be noticed. Laura's voice was cool. "You're being dramatic. There are investors here." Her hand twitched, but I stepped back before she could reach for me again. Ryan gave another slow clap, each beat measured, as if sealing the moment. I turned toward the path leading to the driveway. No one tried to stop me. Guests glanced briefly in my direction, then back to their conversations. The valet still stood at the curb when I approached, his breath visible in the cold air. He opened the door without a word. Inside the car, the faint warmth from the heater pressed against my face where Laura's hand had landed. I started the engine and watched the glow of the string lights in the rearview mirror until they blurred into the dark. The drive home was quiet. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, my thoughts moving in clean lines. By the time I turned into my driveway, I knew exactly where I would go once I stepped inside. I unlocked the door, walked straight to the closet in the hallway, and pulled down the small linen-wrapped box from the top shelf. Its weight was familiar in my hands. I carried it into the kitchen, set it on the table, and turned the small brass key that still hung from a chain around my neck. Inside was the original will Samuel had signed, edges yellowed, but words still sharp. Beneath it lay the USB drive he'd given me in his last days. I touched the cool metal before walking to the den and sliding it into the old laptop we had never replaced. Samuel's voice filled the room, steady, deliberate, certain. He spoke of the life we had built together, of the intentions in his will, and of the truth he wanted preserved if anyone ever tried to change it. Hearing him again didn't break me. It steadied me. When the recording ended, I closed the laptop, placed the will and USB back into the box, and locked it once more. Then I reached for a notepad and wrote down 3 names. The next morning, I would make 3 calls, and I would not be erased. The next morning came before the sun had fully risen. The house was still and quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to settle deeper after a long night. I made a cup of tea, the steam curling up in slow spirals, and sat at the kitchen table with the notepad I had left there the night before. 3 names stared back at me in my handwriting, each one tied to a piece of my past that had never fully closed. I started with the first number dialing from memory. Harold answered on the second ring. His voice hadn't changed, steady, deliberate, carrying that same weight it always had when my husband trusted him with something important. We hadn't spoken in years yet. There was no hesitation in the way he said my name. I told him everything from the moment the invitation arrived to the folder on the table and the slap that followed. He listened without interruption, only asking at the end if I still had the documents. I promised to scan them that afternoon and bring them to his office the next day. Before we hung up, his voice dropped slightly. Samuel always knew this might come. He wanted you to have what you'd need when it did. The second call was to Dolores. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice warm, but tinged with that weariness I remembered from the final years she worked at the foundation. I asked if she remembered why she had left so suddenly. She chuckled, not bitter, just resigned. Claire, she explained, had told her she didn't bring enough value to the team, that she was dead weight. Dolores didn't ask why I was calling only when I wanted to meet. We settled on that same afternoon. She insisted on bringing pastries. The 3rd call was the most delicate. Evelyn Carter had worked with Samuel during the early years of our family trust, back when every decision was handwritten in ledgers and signed in ink. When she answered, she sounded genuinely surprised, but pleased to hear my voice. I told her I needed help checking recent activity on certain accounts. Nothing illegal, just confirmation that no changes had been made without my consent. She paused long enough for me to hear her thinking. If something is happening, you deserve to know. Let me look into it and call you back. By late morning, I had moved the box from the kitchen table to the den and laid out the contents in careful order. The will, the USB drive, and a small stack of statements Samuel had kept. I powered up the old scanner and began creating digital copies, labeling each file exactly as Harold had instructed over the phone. When Dolores arrived, the scent of warm lemon scones followed her through the door. We sat in the living room with tea, talking quietly about the early days of the foundation and the people who kept it running without recognition. Before she left, she handed me a printed roster from 5 years ago, the last year she had been listed as a board member. After she left, I returned to the table and began reviewing the foundation's expenses over the last 2 years. A few entries were familiar, but several stood out. One payment of $16,000 was marked as a consulting fee to a newly registered company. The initials in the company name matched Claire's. I printed the statement and circled the entry in red. Another payment of $37,000 had gone to a luxury spa in Colorado, categorized under community outreach. I searched the name online and found photographs from a retreat last spring. Laura, in a white robe, champagne in hand, surrounded by friends. No mention of the foundation or any public event. Mid-afternoon, the phone rang. Evelyn's voice was calm but deliberate. She had found that 2 trustee accounts were in the process of having their contact information changed. My name replaced with Ryan's using a scanned letter bearing my signature. She compared it to my other forms and confirmed it didn't match. She said she had flagged the change for now, but warned that Ryan was already acting as though it had gone through. I thanked her and hung up my mind, moving faster now. By early evening, the table was covered in organized stacks. I had folders labeled for the Trust Unauthorized Payments Foundation misuse and personnel changes. Each folder contained both the original paper and a scanned copy stored on a secure drive Harold had arranged. I added a simple timeline of events starting with the day the invitation arrived. Before closing everything for the night, I called Sharon Miller, a notary who had known Samuel since his first years in public service. She agreed to stop by the next day to witness and sign an affidavit confirming the contents and authenticity of my records. The house was dark when I finally put the kettle on again. As the water heated, I looked at the table, the neat stacks, the careful labels, the pen resting beside my notes. The pieces were no longer scattered memories. They were documented, dated, and ready. The next step would be handing them to Harold and watching the plan take shape. By the time Sharon arrived the next afternoon, the folders were lined neatly across the dining table. She set her notary case down, adjusted her reading glasses, and began working through each document in order. The quiet scratch of her pen filled the room as she signed and stamped the affidavit that confirmed the contents and authenticity of my files. When she finished, she slid the pages back toward me and placed her stamp beside them for a final press. "You've kept everything in order," she said, giving a small nod before gathering her things. The following morning, Harold stepped into my kitchen as if no time had passed since the days he visited with Samuel. He moved slower now, leaning on a cane, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He sat at the table without ceremony, opened his briefcase, and began laying out 3 letters he had drafted from the evidence I'd given him. His tone was measured as he explained each one. The first was addressed to Ryan, outlining the potential criminal charges that could arise from presenting forged documents to a financial institution with receipts and transaction dates linking both him and Claire to the transfers. The second letter was for Laura. It detailed the misuse of family funds for her spa retreats and matched each withdrawal to specific event dates. One vendor name in particular, a luxury retreat in Napa Valley, was circled in red. Harold had included a note that the payments came directly from an account earmarked for educational grants. The third letter was the most significant. It held a certified copy of Samuel's original will, a transcript of his recorded message, and a sworn affidavit verifying its authenticity. This letter wasn't going to the children at all. It was addressed to our family bank and the state estate authority. Harold closed the folder on the third letter and tapped it lightly. "This one moves first," he said. "Once it's in their hands, the rest follows." I agreed without hesitation. We decided he would deliver the bank and state copies himself, ensuring they reached the right people without delay. He called a woman named Marion, who had once worked under Samuel, and arranged to meet her that afternoon. She still spoke of him with the same respect she'd held decades ago and assured Harold she would see the documents placed directly into secure channels. When Harold left for his meeting, I stepped out into the garden. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and soil, and for the first time in weeks, I felt as though I wasn't chasing after the truth anymore. By early evening, Harold returned with confirmation that the letters were received. We sat at the table again, while he drafted the final supporting documents, each one numbered and dated to match the timeline I'd assembled. Before he left, he looked at me steadily. "They won't see this coming, Margot. They never thought you'd take a stand." The next morning, the calls began. Ryan's voice was clipped, almost formal, as he asked whether I'd spoken to Harold. He didn't mention the letter directly, but admitted their joint account had been frozen. He said Claire had always managed the finances and hinted that maybe the idea to change the trust wasn't his after all. I let him speak without confirming or denying anything. Later that day, the phone rang again. This time, it was Claire. Her words came fast, at first accusing me of dragging the family name through the mud. When I didn't respond, her tone shifted, offering to make things right if I would reconsider. I stayed silent until she threatened to bring up old family debts and embarrass my parents' memory. My voice was steady when I told her I remembered those times myself. Then I ended the call. That evening, a voicemail from Laura arrived. Her voice wavered as she explained that investors had pulled out of her expansion plans and that the banks had flagged concerns about her funding sources. She claimed she never wanted to cut me out, only that it would have been easier if the story ended my way. I didn't return her call. The documents were already where they needed to be, and each hour that passed brought the next phase closer. By nightfall, I had moved the locked box back to the hallway closet. The will, the recordings, and the affidavits were secured, and the copies remained with Harold. The next step would not require my voice, only my presence when the time came. The meeting was set for 10 o'clock in a small conference room at Harold's office. The long wooden table was worn smooth at the edges, the kind of surface that had seen decades of quiet agreements and tense negotiations. I arrived first, wearing the same blue coat I had worn to Samuel's funeral. It wasn't for effect, it was simply the one I reached for that morning without thinking. Laura came in next, her steps slower than usual, her face pale and drawn. She placed her purse carefully on the table, but didn't look at me. Ryan followed his suit, perfectly pressed his jaw tight. Claire was the last to enter, high heels clicking against the tile, her makeup flawless, though her eyes moved constantly, scanning the room as if measuring it. Harold closed the door behind them and laid 3 folders in front of his seat. His gaze moved around the table before he nodded toward me. I stood, resting both hands on the table's edge. "This isn't a negotiation," I said evenly. "It's a correction." The room stayed still. I explained that Samuel's will remained intact and had never been legally revised or reassigned. All attempts to alter it had no legal standing. Ryan shifted in his chair and Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. Laura lowered her head. I continued telling them the evidence they had all seen or would soon see was already in the hands of the bank and the estate authority. Then I told them something none of them expected. "I'm not keeping it," I said. All 3 looked up at once. I explained that the assets were being placed into a new foundation, one dedicated to providing scholarships and resources for women who had been erased within their own homes. The name was "For Those They Forgot." Samuel had used that phrase in a letter years ago, and it fit. I slid the first page of the foundation's charter across the table. "Your father once told me I was the glue that held everything together. Then you forgot me. But forgetting doesn't erase it, only delays what must return." Ryan let out a sharp breath. Claire's fingers drummed lightly against the folder in front of her. Laura's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this?" I didn't answer. Harold distributed the legal structure of the fund, each section transparent and clear. There would be no personal withdrawals, no hidden accounts. The assets would be managed by an independent board with oversight from the state. Every dollar would be tracked. Claire began to speak about legacy and bloodlines, but I raised my hand to stop her. "Legacy is what you leave in truth, not what you take in secret." I gathered my coat and moved toward the door. The silence that followed wasn't strained. It was heavy, the kind that settles when there's nothing left to argue. By the time I stepped into the hallway, I felt the weight in the room behind me stay where it belonged. The foundation was set in motion, the assets redirected, and the next steps already unfolding beyond their reach. The fallout hadn't begun yet, but it would. 3 days after the meeting at Harold's office, the first call came from the senior account manager at Morgan Financial. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge under each word. She explained that Ryan's access to the family fund had been suspended while the bank investigated a series of irregular transactions. The flagged activity included wire transfers labeled as legal retainer fees and early inheritance disbursements, none of which had prior approval. When I asked how it came to their attention, she told me it was reported by Walter Jennings, Samuel's closest friend and former business partner. The next morning, Walter's name appeared indirectly on the local news. A short segment mentioned a high-profile family in Charleston facing internal legal disputes over disputed inheritance transfers. No names were spoken, but the blurred image of our old estate filled the screen behind the anchor. By midday, the impact was visible. Claire's social media pages were locked, her sponsored posts removed. A press release from her public relations firm cited unrelated personal matters, but I knew the timing wasn't accidental. Laura's situation unfolded in a separate thread. News spread among her spa's investment partners that the source of her startup capital was under review. Several investors withdrew their interest within hours. The funding trail, reallocated from a dormant educational trust, was no longer hidden. I imagined the calls she was making, the explanations she was piecing together. Ryan's voice on the phone that evening carried no apology. Instead, he accused me of letting the situation become public and weaponizing the family name. I didn't argue. I let the silence hold until he ended the call. The days that followed were quiet in my own home, but outside, the ripples spread. The bank moved forward with freezing accounts tied to the disputed transactions. A subpoena followed requesting full disclosure of trust activity over the past 3 years. The weight of it all was beginning to show in the silence from Laura. She had been the most vocal in recent years, but now there was nothing. No email, no call, no knock at the door. Late one afternoon, a knock finally came. It was deliberate, unhurried. When I didn't move, the voice on the other side spoke softly. "It's me, Claire." She didn't sound angry, only tired. I had already written a note earlier in the day, sealing it in an envelope with her name. I slid it under the door without opening it. The hallway was quiet, except for the sound of paper lifting and the faint rustle as she opened it. The note was brief. I reminded her that I had once been her mother-in-law, that I had made soup when she was sick, hemmed her dress when she was busy, and stood behind her at Ryan's graduation, even when she forgot to thank me. I told her I was now simply Mrs. Margot Landry and I would not open the door. She didn't reply. Her footsteps faded down the path, the gate clicked shut, and I turned back to find Dolores sitting on the couch, flipping through a folder. She had been there all afternoon, finalizing the paperwork for the foundation. The state had approved the nonprofit charter. We had to name a seal and the first list of women to receive support. The phrase, "for those they forgot," had come from Samuel in a letter to a friend years ago. He believed the greatest danger wasn't hatred. It was indifference, the quiet forgetting of those who made the smallest sacrifices. Now, with the foundation ready to launch, that idea had a place to grow. That evening, I stepped onto the back porch with a cup of tea. The wind had eased, and the garden moved only in gentle motions. It wasn't triumph I felt, or even relief, just steadiness. The next step would take this beyond my home and into the open. The morning of the foundation's launch was quiet in my house. Light came through the kitchen window in a soft gold, catching the steam rising from my tea. I didn't check the mail or turn on the news. The paperwork was done, the approvals secured, and the first meeting with our initial recipients set for later in the week. All that was left now was to let the work begin. By mid-morning, Dolores arrived with a box of printed brochures. She set them on the table and opened one to check the layout. The foundation's seal, a simple circle with the name "For Those They Forgot," sat above a photograph of a garden in bloom. Inside each page outlined our mission, the application process, and the resources we would offer. We went through them together page by page, making small notes about which ones to keep for donors and which to hand directly to partner organizations. While we worked, my phone lit up with a number I recognized, but hadn't seen in months. I let it ring. A voicemail followed, and after a moment, curiosity made me press play. It was Ryan. His tone was controlled but strained, as if he'd rehearsed each word. He said the accounts remained frozen, that Claire was considering legal options, and that Laura had stopped returning his calls. He wanted to find a path forward, though he didn't say for whom. I set the phone aside without replying. That afternoon, Dolores and I walked through the garden, discussing where we might hold the first small donor gathering in the spring. The air was crisp, and the rosemary bushes along the path released their scent when brushed. I pictured the tables set under the trees, the conversations happening in the open air, far from the quiet hostility of the gatherings my children once hosted. As the sun began to lower, the phone rang again. This time, it was a reporter from a regional paper. She said she'd heard about the foundation and wanted to feature it in an upcoming series on local philanthropy. I declined an interview, telling her she could use the press release we had already prepared. The focus, I explained, should remain on the women we intended to help, not on me. She agreed, promising to send a fact-check request before anything went to print. That evening, after Dolores left, I stepped back out to the porch with another cup of tea. The garden had grown darker, but I could still see the outlines of the plants, the steady shapes that stayed even when the seasons shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's dog barked once, then fell silent. I thought about the calls that might still come, the letters that might still arrive, and knew the real turning point had already passed. The rest was just the quiet work of letting consequences settle. Inside, I stacked the brochures neatly in a box by the door, ready for delivery the next morning. The first step was done. The next would take the foundation's name beyond my circle into places where it might mean something to someone I would never meet. And that, I thought, was exactly where it belonged. The first shipment of brochures went out on a clear, cold morning. I loaded the boxes into the back of Dolores's car, and together we drove to the community center that had agreed to host our first information session. The woman at the front desk smiled when she saw the foundation's name and said she'd already heard good things. We left a stack by the door and another in the main hall, then headed to a nearby shelter to do the same. By the end of the day, the brochures were in the hands of people who might need them most. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand speeches or photo opportunities, just quiet conversations, the exchange of a few nods, and the sense that something had shifted. For the first time in a long while, the steps I took were toward building rather than defending. In the weeks that followed, letters began arriving, some from women who had lived through stories much like mine, others from those who had only just found the courage to speak. A few included nothing but a thank you and a return address. I read each one slowly, setting them in a small wooden box I kept on the kitchen counter. That box became a reminder that even the smallest acts could grow into something lasting. Ryan never called again, and Claire's silence stayed unbroken. I didn't need to wonder why. People make their choices, and sometimes those choices mean walking away without explanation. The difference now was that their absence no longer felt like a wound. It was simply space I could use for something better. One evening, I walked the garden paths alone, the rosemary and sage brushing my hands. The air was cool and the light was fading, but the plants were steady and sure. It struck me that this was the lesson I had needed all along. You don't wait for someone else to plant what you need. You put it in the ground yourself and tend it season after season. If there's anything I've learned, it's that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet strength of standing your ground, the patience to wait for roots to take hold, and the choice to build something that outlasts the people who doubted you. Thank you for walking this path with me. If you've ever had to reclaim your own story, I'd love to hear it. Share it if you can. You never know who might be waiting to feel less alone.